I want to ask you a question this morning. And I'm going to tell you admittedly up front, it's not a question that you're going to have an answer for. But my hunch is it's a question you've asked more than once in your life. Have you ever asked the question, why? Have you ever looked at the circumstances around your life, the situation that you found yourself in, and said, why me? Now I know there's people who would say and would testify that, they've wanted to ask the question, why? And they said, well, then I thought about it and said, why not me? And there's certainly validity to that. But when you're going through those times, that's not much help. In fact, that's not much help at all to say, why not me? When everything around you seems to be crumbling, when everything that you used to know, that used to make sense, doesn't make sense anymore. And if we were to be perfectly honest, as Christians, when we come to those why times in our lives, truthfully, we feel pretty guilty about asking the question. Oh, if I was a person of faith, I wouldn't ask why. And songs like we sang this morning, unless you really hear the words to them, honestly, kind of make us feel guilty. And we miss the powerful message that is behind the why times in our life. I've been struck this morning by the number of why places just in this room this morning. The number of whys that we could ask. And by the way, right at the beginning, let me just tell you, God's big enough for all the whys. God's big enough for all the whys. But the truth of the matter is, there are times in life when we, right here, right now, need some word from God to get us through the why. To get us through the incredible pain and disorientation and struggle when we're caught in the vortex of the why. Now, I will use this very same passage next week when I bring the message that I was going to bring this morning, because there's so many different layers here that we need to explore in different situations. But I am struck this morning by how relevant the story of Joseph, the great champion of the faith, is to the situation we oftentimes find ourselves in. Let me just play that story for you briefly. Now, Joseph, if you remember, was the favorite son of Jacob. And I mean, he wasn't just the little favorite son, he was the greatest favorite son. He was the spoiled youngest before Benjamin came along, upon whom the father heaped all of the gifts, all of the attention. He was the poster child for the spoiled son. And somewhere along the way, his brothers caught wind of that. Now Jacob was, at that time in his life, was a man after God's own heart. He was living the covenant as it was. He was living for God right then. And that's all Joseph ever knew, was this home lived in the power of God. But that did not diminish the jealousy between the brothers. The older brothers who were the workers, and Joseph who was the dreamer. And they decided one day that they needed to get rid of Joseph. So they were going to kill him. That's a really godly thing to do. We'll just kill him and we'll be done with him. Well, cooler heads prevailed in the form of the brother Reuben. He said, no, we can't kill him, because if we kill him, our father will certainly die too. So let's just sell him into slavery. And they threw him in a hole, and sure enough, that's what they did. A band of roving traders came by, they sold Joseph, they made a little money, they got Joseph out of their hair, everything seemed to be okay, unless you're Joseph. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be Joseph in the pit on that morning? To go from favored son status to a slave. picture. Do you think Joseph in the well, or Joseph when he's bound on the Midianite's camel, headed to who knows where, thought to ask the question, why? I do. I do. You don't go from the top of the world to the bottom of the pit without wondering, why me, God? And of course, along the way, he makes several stops in the journey, and the situation is always the same. Joseph finds favor because that's the kind of, for some reason, there's something about his personality, there's something about his work ethic that causes the cream to rise to the top, whether it's with the Midianite traders, or in the house of Potiphar, or in the jailer, or in the royal court of the Egyptian Pharaoh. Joseph always rises to the top. And he gets right there. And whoof, the rug gets pulled out from under him. One time it's because he's doing the right thing. In Potiphar's house, when Potiphar says, hey, Potiphar's wife says, hey, that Joseph, he's a pretty good-looking boy. But when it was the easiest thing in the world to do, Joseph stayed true to his values and said, no, not going to do that. And he felt her wrath, and he ended up in jail. And there he works his way up and finds favor because of his character, because of who he was. That he's interpreting dreams. God gives him this gift that when people dream something, he can interpret it and tell them what it is. And he rises to the top and he thinks, just. And then the guys that are the tools, he thinks, of his deliverance, forget about it. He spends years more in jail thinking, man, that butler and that baker, they certainly did me wrong because they were going to tell everybody what it was that God's done through me. Do you think Joseph was asking the question why while he was waiting in the Egyptian prison? You see, sometimes God's timing isn't our timing. That doesn't make him any less of a God in the waiting time than it does in the acting time. Even though we're left there to wonder, why? Why is this happening to me? Why is this going on? And then, of course, you know the story. He gets out of jail and he becomes an official in the Pharaoh's court. And he rises to where he's second in command of all of Egypt. And he interprets Pharaoh's dream and sets the economic plan in place that will come to the place where one day, many years later, many miles removed from the pit on the backside of Judea somewhere, to the Pharaoh's court, where his brothers in a time of famine are sent to gather food. And for whatever reason, the brothers don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph is the very one that they have to come to say, excuse me, sir, can we have some food? Now, I don't know about you, but I was Joseph. My thoughts wouldn't go where Joseph's thoughts did. He gave them food and sent them home and said, I'm not giving you any more until you bring your brother back, the youngest, who's now the favorite, and bring your father back. And he saves his whole family because of the wise along the way. And it's only, now think about this for a minute. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes. When you're in the pit, listening to your brothers haggle over the sale price with the Midianite traders. When you went from a fine coat of many colors to torn and bloody rags. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes when he lands in prison, unjustly accused, just trying to do what it was that God would want him to do. From Potiphar's house and a life of work but ease to a jail with really bad food, really nasty cells, and real criminals for roommates. yourself in Joseph's shoes when for years after the butler and the baker were delivered because of your ministry, and they forgot all about it. And he sat there wondering, why me? And it's only years and years and years later, when his brothers and his father stand before him, that he's able to say, now I see. Now I see why all of these years. And I would like to stand here this morning as your pastor and say, you're always going to know why somewhere. But I need to call your attention to another passage of faith. We find it in Hebrews chapter 11. It's right at the end of the Hall of Faith where Joseph is mentioned again in the New Testament, where Abraham is mentioned, where all of the heroes of our faith are mentioned, where the prophets are mentioned. It talks about wonderful, wonderful spiritual occurrences, like being stoned and torn in two and persecuted, and women losing husbands and killed with the sword. They went about, I'm reading from Hebrews 11:37 right now. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. It's great to be a follower of God, isn't it? Until you read that passage. But then you need to hear what comes next. And all of these, in the great hall of faith, and all of these, though commended through their faith, and here it comes, did not receive what was promised. And I have to tell you, inside of me, that inner 2-year-old wants to raise myself up and say, but that's not fair! And it's not. Because it's one more why. But here's what I want you to hear this morning. Did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. In the why time. They did not receive what was promised, that God had provided something better for us. But apart from us, they should not be made perfect. You see, the author to the Hebrews, as the Genesis story weaves its way outward in life, tells us there are times in life when we simply do not know why. When all of the stuff that goes on, all of the things that tears at the very center of our being, doesn't make sense, and can't make sense, and won't make sense. Because we live in this world that is so terribly messed up. But that is not the final word. Amen. Because in the middle of the mess, Jesus. When you want to look at the ultimate why, look at the cross. Because there, God, get this, God traded the glory of heaven for the ultimate why. That by his death, our sins would be forgiven. And that by his resurrection, we would again. Now here's the caveat. Even if not now. The ultimate statement of faith is that though, this is Job, though he slay me. You know what slay means, right? Though he slay me. In other words, though I do not know why, yet will I trust him. Because you see, here's the glory of the cross. In the middle of the whys, in the right here, the right now, the pain, God. In the deepest and darkest of whys, God, who is alive and in the room. I'm not sure, Pastor Nicole, they still don't seem very excited about that. Even in the middle of the darkness, God is alive and in the room. Amen. And though in our human, tinier yet, limited capacity for thought, God is making sense out of it all. God is making sense out of it all. Have you ever been on a road trip where you're not the driver? There's a certain amount of trust that has to happen with that. When I was little, we used to go on trips. Sometimes it was just up on the hill behind my grandparents' house. My grandmother loved to make sassafras tea, and we had sassafras trees up on the hillside. And, little guy, 7, 8, 9 years old, we go on an adventure up on top of the hill. Now, we were never more than 300 yards from the house. But somehow, in my 7, 8, 9-year-old way of thinking, we were on the other side of the world. And I would ask the question, Grandma, are we lost? Grandma, do you really know the way to get back home? Or, here's a great, we took a trip all the way across country from Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania to Greeley, Colorado. We'd had enough of that trip. My grandmother and I decided she needed to be home. So we flew home. I had never flown before. Somewhere between Denver and Pittsburgh International Airport in about 1972, flying, 28, 29, 30,000 feet with my grandmother, who had never flown before. I said, Grandma, where are the parachutes? Because you see, I just wasn't certain that she knew where we were going. Have you ever been somewhere with somebody else behind the wheel of the car? And you know where you were supposed to go, but it sure didn't look like the way you ought to get there. And then, much to your surprise, somewhere along the way, you end up where you're supposed to be. That's the faith of the child of God. Because though we might not understand why, right here, right now, we might not understand how it's all going to work out, God. The two greatest statements of God's grace that I know of are, but